Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Welcome to another episode of the Extrology podcast. Today we're diving into the world of RegTech with a very special guest, Ben Parker, founder and CEO of eflow Global. eflow stands at the forefront of regulatory technology and is shaping the future of compliance and surveillance in the financial services sector. So what's the story behind the story? Well, Ben has a really interesting background. He studied religion, philosophy and ethics at King's College London. So what is it that inspired his studies in that direction? How do you go from religion, philosophy and ethics to the city and the regulatory environment? How do you go from religion, philosophy and ethics to running a regulatory technology company? We touch on a range of subjects, from that whole issue around philosophy and ethics, the subject of religion, the regulatory framework, the global financial crisis, the impact that's had on compliance, how you evolve from rigid structures to enable the cloud to enjoy the part that it has to play on all of our technology frameworks today. We talk about influences on his career, who he admires, what drives him, what success means to him, and perhaps with the benefit of hindsight and looking back, what advice he might give a 21-year-old Ben Parker. So come join us on the Extrology podcast. Check us out on our socials. You can join us on Instagram, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. If you want to get in touch, DM us. If you want to reach out via email, you can reach me on lee@extrology.com. We really look forward to engaging with you and really appreciate your eyes and ears on the podcast. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Ben Parker, welcome to the Extrology podcast. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Lee. It's good to be here.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So look, we've lots to explore today, not least your journey into financial services regulation is going to form, and technology, a big chunk of our conversation. But I think, as is always the case with Extrology, we like to understand a bit of the context and a bit of the story behind the story. So for the benefit of listeners, let's start with childhood. I'm intrigued to find out more about where you grew up and what, therefore, childhood was like for you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in a very small Australian country town called Taree, which is about 4 hours north of Sydney. And childhood was very much outdoorsy. You know, that was my passion, and what I spent most of my time doing was outdoors, as most Australian kids are, with their shoes off and running around in the streets. And then got to my teenage years, and then I had the unfortunate, probably fortunate occasion where my parents took me and yanked me out of lovely New South Wales life and stuck me in a boarding school in Somerset. So that was my very much diametrically opposed upbringing in terms of experiences.
Did they come with you?
Yes, yeah. No, I didn't get sent.
Okay.
No, that would have been a bit harsh to send a send a teenager halfway around the world to get a good dose of English boarding school.
I had a guest I was recording with yesterday who was born and raised in India, but that had made reference to the fact that he was sent off to boarding school at the age of 5. So we got into a really interesting discussion around how that equipped him he left to live with an aunt in the US as a conscious decision by them as a family, age 14. And we got into a conversation as to whether, how his boarding school experiences equipped him for that, kind of being yanked away from mum and dad. But it sounds as though yours stayed close and they came over to the UK as well.
They did, but that sort of experience when you're in a boarding school, which is, 24/7, you don't necessarily see them even if they're 10 miles down the road. So it was, and it was a very very religious school run by Benedictine monks. So it's certainly an experience to be put into that. So new country and very much new surroundings.
Interesting. And had you siblings? Did they come with you as well?
Yeah, I have a brother who came across as well, but he's returned to Australia.
Okay. Did the lure of the sunshine prove too much?
Yes, but maybe the lure of the rain appealed too much to me to go back. Yeah.
So who were your heroes? Who perhaps did you look up to as a child?
That's a very good question. I would say that, as I mentioned before, I was very outdoorsy. So actually, two of my passions were, I was very passionate about sport, but also dance as well. So I think that in the sports world, there was probably a few Australian cricketers that I looked up to. And then in in sort of the dance world, did a lot of ballet. So it's more about any performer that was performing in one of the favorite ballets as well. So Don Quixote, Swan Lake, all of those. That's probably who I looked up to at the most. And then also my parents are both entrepreneurial themselves. And I think that's where I very much got the itch from having gone into the corporate world for a few years. I think I wanted to get out of it pretty quickly. And, they were very much role models in terms of leading me on that path.
I think the dance, so a guilty pleasure, not many people know this of me, but so as a kid, my parents loved to dance, right? So I'm the eldest of three. My parents were always going to dance class every week, loved music, grew up with a house full of music. And, I would have been, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. Inevitably, they didn't always get a babysitter. We'd get dragged along. And eventually my mum was like, come on, get up and dance. Before you know it, long story short, I danced ballroom and Latin American when I was a kid. Okay. So humble brag, ended up age 10, getting to the World Youth Dance Championship semi-final. Danced at the Royal Albert Hall, my partner and I. We came 14, made it to semi-final. We were 13th out of 14. So we didn't, but I still think, that's quite some accolade. I went through this really, I'm older than you, and growing up as a kid in England in the late 70s, early 80s, boys didn't dance. Right? Yeah. So we were fortunate that we now live in a world where we're much more accepting and open as to the plethora of opportunities and choices that we can make. But it was a judgment call. So I was like you, sports mad, absolutely sports mad. So I then got to this point where it's like I dance and I play sport, and I'm getting the Mickey taken out of me for the dance, and so therefore that forced me down almost to be more sporting. More sport, any sport. It's like I've got to do sport because I'm trying to prove something. I don't know. I'd have been 10-year-old kid. It's like, well, the risk of being assumptive. Did you experience similar kind of challenges and maybe if prejudices are the right word, but judgments around dancing and why you were dancing and all those kind of good things? Was it as tough as I might imagine it could have been?
It was. Yeah, obviously we're talking about the 90s here, but it was still exactly the same. And I was playing, the sport I was playing most then was rugby. So you can imagine. Actually, I thought that it was a benefit to my rugby, being agile on my feet, and certainly the ballet and the jazz dancing.
And there's all sorts of evidence to support exactly that. And if you look at where we are today and the fact that, top sports men will engage in yoga, Pilates, dance, whatever it might be, strength and conditioning, it's all wrapped up in that sphere, and it's all understood from a sports science perspective. That it wasn't in the 19. I can only speak from my own experience of the 1980s when, before a game you had steak and chips. That was the kind of level of sports science that was imparted.
Absolutely.
So I can imagine it was a very different time.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I had to give up one, and obviously the dance went and the rugby took over. Yeah,
same for me. Hence why it's a slightly self-indulgent question, but your experiences and mine are quite, in that respect, quite similar. It was kind of like, well, what are you going to do? You can only do one. You've only got so much free time. I'm going to play sport.
Absolutely.
And I don't regret the choice, but with the benefit of hindsight, I wonder why oftentimes I made that choice. And I think peer pressure would have had an expectation, would have had perhaps a huge part to play. I still love my sport. These days I can barely dance a step, but I still try and kid myself that I can.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I've got 2 left feet now, so it's unless it's choreographed, I'm terrible.
Yeah, muscle memory is a nonsense, right? There's no such thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So your interest, sport were interests. You mentioned some Aussie cricketers there. I'm a huge cricket fan. I spent most of my life growing up watching us getting royally stuffed up until about 2005, which, we don't have many Ashes wins to mention, us Brits. So, when we can mention one, we kind of want to get it in there. But, who were the heroes in the 90s? Who were you looking up to? I'm guessing the War boys would have been...
Yeah, the War brothers. There was David Boone, Merv Hughes, all of those guys. I was lucky because I wasn't aware of cricket until the 1987 Ashes, and I think that was the last time England won it until the big gap, until 05. Yeah. So, it was, for me, it was just a succession of, Glenn McGrath, Gilchrist, Hayden, all of those guys. Just a succession of star cricketers, and I think as a fan at the time, I thought it would never end. But then we went through the wilderness for a few years, but it seems to be coming good. Well, for Australian fans anyway, not necessarily for the English cricket team.
No, absolutely. But, to your point, you thought it would never end. I can assure you it was the same for us.
Absolutely.
This is never going to end. We're never going to beat these guys. I remember once seeing Shane Warne bowl at Hampshire. I'm a Hampshire boy. And I remember watching Warne bowl, and I was struck by how quickly he was bowling at 65 miles an hour. I had in my head the guy's, he's incredible, the greatest spin bowler I've ever seen. But I had this idea in my head that, spinning was about throwing up, throwing up pies, right? You just churn it up in the air, nice and steady. And it's but the flight and the art and the craft of the man was just astounding. Even from a boundary rope, it was phenomenal to see. Huge talent.
Yeah, those guys bowl faster than your Sunday League opening bowlers.
Yeah.
The spinners. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the thing that really struck me and I might have clumsily hit upon a thread here, one of the things that struck me about your academic background was your choice of degree. I think it's a really interesting choice, particularly when we come on to talk about how your career has evolved beyond that.
Yeah.
But that you've a BA in religion, philosophy and ethics from King's, as I recall. And
yes.
That's, my first thought when I was doing my research was that's a really fascinating degree choice. What might have led you to make that choice was my first thought. But I suspect given the schooling, and that's a clumsy assumption, but that there's possibly some influence there. But what was it that inspired you to pursue your studies in that direction?
Yeah, so I missed that part out of my upbringing. So I came from a fairly religious upbringing, which then correlate to the schooling as well. And I think I'm of that era where you barely paid for university, so it's what everybody did. You didn't really think about it. And I think that it was an angle that I wanted to go down in terms of that religious route, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it at that time. I knew I wanted to do humanities. And then I had this epiphany, I think, when I was in the middle of that degree. So unfortunately, I went the other direction and I became a non-believer. And at that point, it's not only a faith pivot, it's also, well, if I was going to do this anything career-related, then I'm going to have to find something else to do, because I'm certainly not going to go into any sort of religious academia or even philosophy, etc. I enjoyed my time doing it, but I also then needed to move away from that and find a different career path.
What did you enjoy? You mentioned you enjoyed your time doing it. What did you enjoy about it?
I think the exposure to, so the combination of, I didn't want to do pure philosophy, so I'd done a lot of philosophy at school. I didn't want to go down that route necessarily, and the mixture of the religious studies element to it, I'd never had the exposure to other monotheistic or polytheistic religions, and I think that really interested me, because you can be in that environment and you almost get indoctrinated with, this is everything you believe, and then when you get exposure to these other religions out there and you see the parallels, the similarities, but then also you can almost trace, and this is going to be a controversial thing to say, but I think you can trace a lot of the teachings all the way back to the same point. You tend to be a divergence at some time in history where people believe different things. Ultimately, if you trace it all back, certainly on a monotheistic religion, you're still looking at one God, and it's just the story, the narrative has changed a bit over time, and I found that quite interesting, and obviously how that plays a part in the world today, how it causes so much fraction in the world, and I found all of those elements very interesting about learning about other religions, and very much how it shaped our history and continues to shape the future, and unfortunately a lot of the conflict that's in the world today as well is about belief.
It strikes me that it's a fascinating insight into kind of fundamental human psychology. How cultures and nations and religions and movements have evolved and adapted and grown. And therefore, I'd imagine when you come onto the career side of things, clumsy analogy maybe to draw, but then as an insight into human nature, what drives decision-making, thought process, perspective, instinct, all of these kind of things you start to look at through a really interesting lens, given that you've gotten at least an academic kind of understanding of where many of these constructs have originated from.
Exactly. And you add in the element of the philosophical and also the ethical part of that degree. When you're understanding just war theory and, the right to die and what is death. So you're covering a lot of areas there. And yeah, as you touch on there, it gives you a different perspective. I think it gives you a bit more of a holistic and empathetic approach to understanding when you're talking the business world. And certainly I've been able to carry that through to understand the rationale that people approach things. So it's very much a thinking degree. And I think that stood me in good stead in terms of not necessarily my immediate career after that, but certainly how I've carried that on to be a founder and then basically in charge of other people. And, they put their faith in me, and I have to then sort of understand where that comes from.
It's I'm struck by two things. First and foremost, I did a guest recently, Ryan Renteria. So Ryan was initially with Goldman Sachs, and then a managing partner with Goldman Sachs by the age of 26. He was running a hedge fund through his 20s, and then ultimately, he's based in the US, but ultimately was running the Indiana Pacers for 10 years in the NBA.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he's written a book called Lead Without Burnout. And we got into this really interesting discussion around, there's now I'm going to butcher the comment given. I think he was right in saying that 75% of CEOs that he'd studied had suggested that thinking and strategy and strategizing and theorizing around that were the number one most important thing for them to do as a CEO. And yet the proportion, which is the bit I can't quite remember, the proportion that never get a chance to do that was enormous. And I think that's partly because, and I challenged him on this, as I think I wonder as to the value that we place upon thinking these days. Once upon a time, to your point, we created statues to highlight the great work of Socrates or whoever it might have, Plato, Aristotle. There's the thinker in Piccadilly Circus. We created statues to these things. And I remember once being asked by somebody for whom I have a lot of respect, the CEO, said to me, "Lee, would you ever read a book at your desk?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And he said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, because people would think I wasn't doing anything." He said, "Well, what if that book was a book on strategy or a book on a business that was impacting your performance, your ability to do your job, and therefore contribute to your organization?" I said, "Well, I'd read it." He said, "Well, where would you read it?" I said, "I'd read it at home at the weekend." He said, "So you'd impact your family life just because you couldn't be seen to be thinking at your desk?" And I went, "No." And it just struck a chord with me that we place such stock on doing. It's a big assumptive, broad sweeping statement, but we place such stock on doing. How do you get that time to think, given you know the value in it, you've studied the value in it? Can you devote the time to it?
Yeah, well, it's a challenging thing, isn't it? Because if we're not doing, we live in a world where everything else is designed to grab our attention. So it's not only do we not make time for ourselves to think. I think that any time that we do have, we gravitate towards doing something else or something that gives short-term gratification, etc. In terms of my own ability to think, funnily enough, a situation like COVID has been fantastic because I was one of those people who was always, in the office, got to be there. If you're not in the office, you're out doing something work related. So the ability to actually, enforced originally, but to take that time where you can in your day, when somebody hasn't got your attention, when you're not in a meeting, that you can actually sit there and think is very valuable. And, I can honestly say I wouldn't, looking back on myself a few years ago, I wouldn't have made that time to do that. I wouldn't have thought, well, you know what I'll do? I do away days with clients. I do away days with staff. I'm in the office. That's what my world exists like. I wouldn't actually then take myself off, stick myself in a room at home and actually just think. And, I certainly see the incredible value in just taking that time.
I think it must be incredibly hard to do, particularly as a founder, and we'll come on to that. But I think, there is that expectation, certainly in those earlier, inevitably, I would imagine you wouldn't be any different to many a founder with whom I've engaged. You're spinning 1,001 plates, desperately trying not to drop one. You might have co-founders or colleagues that you're working alongside, but ultimately the buck stops with you, right? And so certainly in those earlier days, as you're scaling, getting that time out to think and strategize and think about, even 3 months out, 6 months out, a year out, let alone 3-5 years out, when everything is focused on what is it that you're doing today that's affecting today's outcome, is an incredibly difficult thing to achieve.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very lucky that I've had a core group that have been with me for many years now, and I think that I couldn't put enough stock on that and how important that has been to have those people around me, because to me they are very much an extension of myself, and the reliance on them, etc., does allow me to have that space to think.
So I'm fascinated to understand how you go from religion, philosophy, and ethics into the city and the regulatory environment. So what's the story behind eflow?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the story behind going into the city is a very simple one. I had a humanities degree from a reputable university, and that sort of got me in the door. I went into the city like a lot of people do. I ended up in working for a number of sort of small regional German banks, but in the UK, and worked in the middle office. So very much not the glamour world of being a banker as such. But one of the challenges that we had often, working in that space, I was essentially an operational role, was other than automation of other many processes within the bank, was essentially regulatory compliance was highly manual at the time, and there seemed a lot of need for automation, but not the desire within the industry. It was very much at the early days of a lot of financial regulation, and there was an opportunity to work outside of that. Actually, it goes back to my mother, who's actually still a shareholder today. She built a platform for an Australian bank in New York, and that we were able to acquire the IP. There was an opportunity to buy that, so I led the acquisition of that. And then we started off on our journey. Now, we weren't necessarily within regulation at that stage. We had a very small part of the business was regulatory compliance. But then 2008 came, and an opportunity for us. And obviously it was in the national media and all around the world in terms of the crash at the time. There was a real focus on regulation after that, and we saw an opportunity. And funnily enough, there was the same movement at that time to more cloud services, SaaS products, etc. And the finance world wasn't too keen to see a lot of its technology go into the SaaS or cloud space at that time. And so we were able to essentially move in that space with, there's this bit of thing called regulation, and we can automate that and put that data in the cloud. That's fine. And so we jumped on that, and we saw an opportunity, and from there we've gone from strength to strength. So that's obviously it's the leap from religion and philosophy and ethics is not a particularly glamorous one. It was just, I need to find something, I don't believe in it anymore, and I just need to find a new direction in my life. Everybody seems to go into the city, so I'll follow them.
And you mentioned the influence, I guess, therefore, of your mother and the part that she's had to play. And was she did she have a coding software background? Was that her?
Yeah. Well, okay. She had a coding background she started in the 70s. So you can imagine what it was like then for a female coder. And back in those days, it was very, very rare. So yeah, that's why, I talk about inspiration. She always ran her own businesses back then, and she's very much an influence on the direction I've taken in my career.
So was it how you got started? Was the opportunity to purchase that IP that your mum had written, and therefore you could then start to deploy that in a commercial sense amongst
exactly.
the financial services industry?
It was essentially an R&D write-off by the bank, and so I bought it for $1, $1, and then which at that point was probably worth about $5 million in R&D that had been sunk into it. So it was a great opportunity, and so I just latched onto it, and here we are today.
So what were some of the hurdles that you faced in those early days?
I think that as I mentioned there, the movement to really drive to a SaaS business, that in an industry which was still fairly old-fashioned, regulation in itself, it's sort of like tax or adherence to, putting in your tax form. Nobody wants to do your tax return, but you just have to do it. So you almost treat it as a necessary evil. They don't want your products, but they like the efficiency that you bring. So that in the early days, that was a challenge purely because financial institutions knew that they could get away with not doing something. There wasn't really the big fines that we see now in relation to compliance issues or not adhering to regulatory compliance. So that was a challenge in the early days, and just trying to get investment for something like that in the early days. It was, it wasn't a particularly interesting area to invest in RegTech. now, if you went out to the market, in fact, it's one of the only things they are investing in within our space is regulatory compliance. All the VCs and private equity firms. But back then, it was very hard to get any traction. So that was a challenge. And doing the beauty parade in front of all the VCs, that was difficult.
I remember a conversation very vividly with a guest on Extrology who he's a co-founder of an anti-money laundering software. And I remember our conversation, he'd been a banker. And actually, I had the conversation with him. So how do you end up with anti-money laundering software? To his words, it wasn't particularly sexy. He said, interestingly, Lee, as a banker, and he's a Kiwi. He says, as a banker in New Zealand growing up, he said all the businesses that were really sexy. He said, oftentimes vineyards, wineries, that was where it's kind of considered sexy. Never made any money. He said, and I used to look at all the businesses, refuse collection, utilities type businesses, think stuff that people, they have to have. We've got to have it. It might not be considered sexy, if I can use that word, but geez, they made some money.
Absolutely.
Right. So he's like that. So he said, I knew whatever it was that I went to do, it would have to come into that category of must have, not particularly interesting. So therefore not lots of people are going to get involved in it, but actually as a business model, super effective, a real opportunity to carve and drive a real wedge, a niche a mile deep, if you like, within a particular space and be famous for it. And they've gone from strength to strength. And I guess there's again, not trying to put words in your mouth, but there's a similar scenario here is that, and I guess also post global financial crisis, the spotlight is very much more keenly shone upon the need for compliance. Do you think that perhaps post 2008, is the natural inclination, maybe arguably initially, to overregulate, and then it swings back a little, and you get to a balanced point where you go, right, we've got sufficient regulation to protect stakeholders and all interests, and ultimately the longevity of the bank, because if they all, if they fail, we're all in trouble, right?
Yeah.
But actually there's, you carve that niche really effectively. They overregulate to start with, but then it gets a balance, and you get to a really sensible place.
Yeah, obviously at the end of the day, we have to primarily protect the consumer. So, that's the biggest concern. But certainly post 2008, there was significant change. Well, prior to 2000, and the old FSA, that was the Bank of England that did the regulation, and obviously that was a wrong place to have that. It had to be an independent regulator, which was a good move. But then there was knee-jerk reaction in 2008 and post 2008, and I don't think that necessarily was because of the public backlash. It was very much bankers are bad, etc. But They did tighten up regulation at that point. They did go too far, or if they didn't get too far, it wasn't prescriptive enough, and then it was open to interpretation. So it needed a tightening again. Maybe that is a recalibration and bringing that back in line. But I'm always a believer is in this particular situation, you're dealing with people's finances, ultimately their lives. It is white collar crime, and it's not viewed as the same, is it? So. But the impact can be far greater, and I think that from my perspective, there's never too much in this scenario in terms of regulation. Yes, we can recalibrate it, but in terms of protecting the end consumer and protecting people's livelihood and their lives, I think that we can't go too far.
You mentioned that, put words into your mouth, but that reluctance, if you like, to start to put or transition to the cloud, was that about security, control?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so how do you overcome that? If you could see that's the direction of travel, the world is heading that way, but you've got deeply entrenched, I'd imagine, belief that we want to hold on to that stuff. We don't want to even consider or contemplate we might be exposing ourselves to the world, understandably. But how do you overcome that kind of view?
Well, in the first instance, we didn't. We had to provide a solution that was deployed behind their firewalls. It had to be an on-premise solution, but we always had a vision to move away from that. And I think that one of the great helping hands that we did have was the regulators then put a framework in place so that we are essentially an extension of these firms, these investment firms, and there's an operational resilience model around that, which come with all due diligence and audit reporting, etc., and investigation. And I think that from that perspective, there is a lot more confidence. And I appreciate that. Well, I appreciated at the time that there was a move to put personal data. So the individuals you're dealing with, they would be using apps as the smartphones came along, etc. So they were putting their own data into the cloud and realizing that it was secure. And so I think that filtered back into the corporate world. But it wasn't even sort of personal information. It was just trading strategies and sensitive financial information that these investment firms were worried about. And there was this, I think there was a general belief around the world that, cloud computing at the time was that there was this black box out there that our data was going to, and it would end up in China or somewhere like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think how is I think the thing that strikes me, again, I had this conversation yesterday with a guest. We were talking about the idea of extending Moore's law to transformation and actually the pace of change. Is there a sort of similar equivalent, if you like, but that is moving at the same pace? And the sense was that perhaps there is, the one true constant is change. That's always been true, but the pace of technological change is just vast. It's so fast. I mean, how is jumping ahead a little bit in terms of my questions, but how the regulatory environment has changed, how the tech environment has changed over the last 20 years? I would imagine you've seen huge changes in that time.
Absolutely. We even see the use of WhatsApp and other communication channels now in terms of offering financial advice. And it's crazy in terms of the technological advances in that space and how they're being used, and social media being used in finance. Anybody now can access stock markets. They can download an app on their phone. You even have students now trading on markets. Back in the day, it was you talk to your stockbroker and that was about it. You got on the phone. And when I started, we were dealing with, a lot of trading happened either in a pit, and I'm not that old, either on a trading floor or over the phone. And now it's, we've moved to a completely sort of digital world where it's all online. And as I mentioned there, you can download an app and you can start, again, your other guest that you had who does money laundering or KYC, you can go through the biometrics on your phone in about 5 minutes and open an account. And hook it up to your bank account. You can start trading Apple shares if you want to, or Tesla, within a matter of minutes. Yeah,
I mean, how do you keep on top of that? Can you keep on top of it?
It's a good question. It's one of our challenges, is that you now have and everybody is able to access the markets, and we have to be aware of that and able to counter that. So a lot of what we do is behavioral analytics around sort of trading, and we try and spot anomalies, etc. We also monitor communication channels, and there's some things that we can't do. We can't scrape a Reddit room. Chat room for potential, the whole GameStop situation. There's, I'd like to say that we would have been able to stop that, but we couldn't, or even detect it, because we can't access those channels. And so all we can do is make sure that the regulation is there to support the market and make sure that what they're doing, that they're not using technology that they're essentially not supposed to, and they're adhering to that. And that's the best that we can do in relation to that. But in terms of being able to, in the world of what we do, it's almost we're not going to be 2 steps behind, but we'll always be a little bit behind in terms of being able to catch anybody that's doing anything fraudulent on markets.
And what about, this is something that's just sprung to mind, if only because I've just started reading Michael Lewis's latest book, Becoming Infinite, which is the study of Sam Bankman-Fried, and I'm only about halfway through, so I'm not going to try and do justice to what actually is proving to be a really compelling read. But I wonder I'm struck by, you look at the changes to the introduction of crypto and blockchain and the implications that has for the wider financing world. I mean, that fascinates me. I mean, as to that the challenge that's affording are constructs that have been in place for hundreds of years. Centralized central banks, government, etc., etc., etc. All of a sudden, they're kind of, it's like the Wild West. All of a sudden getting free. How do you? The part I'm reading at the moment is debating as to whether or not crypto is a commodity or is it a security, or, so therefore from a US perspective, who's the regulator? Is it the SEC? Blah, 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 blah. So these are just mind-blowingly complex. I'm a very simple man. Mind-blowingly complex issues. For you, at the heart of it is and delivering the technology to enable organizations to comply to the regulatory environment. That must be, presents challenges and opportunities maybe?
It does. It's huge opportunities, but at the same time, the digital asset world, where we're essentially turning a monetary system that's been around for as long as it has been, and turning it on its head with the decentralized monetary system. And I think that there are so many challenges that come with that, because we've always, there's always been something that underpins it, something that regulates it, something that centralizes it. And I think that from a regulator standpoint, the opportunity for us is when that actually comes in, we can move into that space. We can help with the automation. We can help with all of these things. But what that actually looks like in terms of a framework, you're not the only one struggling with that, because there's many smart minds out there who are trying to get their head around decentralized finance and centralized finance, as well as traditional finance. And then there's the regulators trying to actually grapple with that as well. Like, how do we even begin to get on top of this? For our point of view, that presents a great opportunity. We just have to be ready, and tech ready for that opportunity when it does arrive.
So you reflect back on those earlier days of eflow, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that perhaps you would have done differently?
Yeah, I wouldn't have put basically everything I had on on the table at the time. I think it's one of those things that when you're younger, you're a bit more cavalier. I actually shudder to think that at that point I put, I think, pretty much everything other than about 50 quid I had in the bank into it at the time. But I am where I am today, and I certainly don't regret it. But I think that it's hard to look back on it, because obviously I am who I am today, and probably whilst I take many risks in my life, I wouldn't take that many risks. The other thing as well, I look back on it, and I am also proud of the fact that, and I think this goes back to the role model point, is because I had role models in my life at that time, I knew that you can take that risk and you can make it work. It wasn't, and I had examples of that. And I think that probably gave me the courage at the time to actually take that risk and go, you know what, I'm going to go ahead with this.
No, I think inevitably I'll have asked the question as to what it is that you feel you've learned through the journey, but partly that would have been maybe the risk appetite. You might, with the benefit of hindsight, to your point, you wouldn't be where you are today, but that maybe that 50 quid would, you might have left more than that 50 quid in the bank. But was there any, in terms of what you've learned, what else you've learned from the experiences that you've enjoyed today? How would you describe those?
Yeah, I'd say that I probably wasn't a natural leader as such when I started out. I would have thought, if you asked me what a leader was back then, I would have just said, well, it's when you're captaining your cricket team or your rugby team or something like that. And I didn't realize that actually there's so much more to that. You become part of people's lives, which is different from 80 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. It's not just about doing a grand speech and sort of saying, this is where we're going and follow me. There's so much more to it. And I think that I probably didn't put enough thought into the subject that actually the people are what make a business, certainly in our space. And I made quite a few mistakes along the way. I'd say in the early days, when it came to people, not getting the right people on, not incentivizing those that I probably should have done earlier in the day. And I think I somehow along the way managed to correct those ills. And I think when I look back on it now, and certainly looking forward, I think that my people management skills have improved massively, and how to embrace and empathize as well.
I suspect many a founder, though, would share a similar view, that actually you kind of have oftentimes those businesses that grow off the back of the technical competence or expertise in a specific subject area of the founder or the co-founders. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you're now running a business, right? You never. Yeah. And also, I wonder as to your experiences prior to eflow. No, I don't know. Maybe this is just projection and I'm reflecting on my own experiences. But oftentimes, I think earlier in my career, I looked at the people at the top and perceived that in order that you might get there, and certainly that once you'd arrived, it's because you knew everything. That's what makes you the CEO. You kind of all-knowing. So whatever question you're asked, you know the answer. But actually, what I've come to realize over the years is you don't. And the very best ones are the ones that know they don't, and they just ask questions. So to your point, I think to acknowledge that the mistakes that you will have made along the way, I find me the person that's never made a mistake.
Yeah, and well, the other thing as well is you have to transition from wearing many hats, don't you? And then maybe you do know more when you start out, but actually as you scale in the business and you become more diverse, it's those who are able to surround themselves with the right people that do know and the specialties around them. They're the ones that really succeeds because, ultimately, to your point there, you watched Steve Jobs up on stage. Everybody would see Steve Jobs as Apple, but the reality is he surrounded himself with the right people. He wasn't the one bashing the iPhone together. He wasn't sitting there scribbling notes in terms of design sketches, etc. But it's about surrounding yourself with the right people, and that's, I think, certainly what I've been able to do certainly in the last 10 years anyway.
And do you think that's what's enabled you to retain? I think one of the challenges consistently I see from entrepreneurs is like, how do we retain the secret sauce that made us special from the get-go and yet continue to scale? We don't want to lose sight of where we've come from. We want to keep clearly an eye on where we're going, but there's something special about whether it's culture, vision, values, whatever it is. We've got this sort of secret sauce, how we retain that. But, as we slowly introduce some guardrails and we become more compliant, systemized and process oriented, we want to do all those good things so we can scale, but we want to keep that secret sauce. Picking the right people becomes absolutely critical to achieve that.
Yeah, culture is so important, and maintaining that. And I think bringing the right people into that culture and that team is, absolutely essential. But actually, in fact, what I've learned is that, bringing the wrong people in can be even more important. Like making sure the wrong people aren't in there is more important than bringing the right people sometimes. Because I never really thought about bringing something in and upsetting the apple cart with the wrong person. And so culture is just sort of maintaining that source, if you will, as you mentioned there, is difficult because there is a certain corporate tilt that you end up with when you grow, when you have investors. And I'm sure, as when you become a public company, as your friend found out, it changes even again. So that it becomes even harder to maintain that culture that you had that made it special at the beginning. But I think that we're at a stage of our growth, and certainly with 4 of the team being with the business now over 10 years, I think the senior management, I think that is rare to have directors who have been with the business that long whilst we're still growing. And I think that trickle-down ethos that we have, as long as we're here and I'm here, I think we can maintain that. If we become public, then, you'd probably ask me again in a few years and I might have a different answer.
And you've, certainly as I recall, you just enjoyed, may or may not be the right choice of phrase, but nonetheless, you've just successfully raised capital. Therefore, I'd imagine a really exciting time begs the question as to what next. What's the future for eflow?
Yeah, well, that capital is driving our expansion. So we're driving outside of the UK and EU, which is a traditional market. So North America, we're going to take on the US market, which, as we know, across industry is always a bit of a challenge, with different sort of cultures, etc. But that's part of it, and then also back to sort of my original home territory of the Asia Pacific region. So we're growing out there. When it comes to regulation, the UK and EU have always been very much ahead in this. So it's always proved to be the blueprint, and I think that we're able to now, in the next 5 years, ride the wave that we're now seeing across region, especially in Asia, where we're seeing the enforcement of financial regulations really taking hold. So that's the growth areas for us. And then, from a personal standpoint, I think that the next 5 years may be another raise, or we may look to some sort of other event at that point in time. But certainly for the next couple of years, very much about, head down and hopefully occasionally having time to sit there and to think and get my head above water.
Possibly on an airplane. I suspect the air miles are going to take a hammering as the expansion as you've got involved. But what about you? You mentioned earlier, if we reflect perhaps back to yourself and obviously eflow and your own journey, but ultimately, wrapped up entirely. But in terms of those influences on your career, you mentioned the role that your parents have had to play, the influence your parents have had to play on your career. But who else perhaps have been among those big career influences for you, and why?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm going to say something cliche here and say that my wife as well. She's... Yeah. So she went down the academic route. And the reason why I say her is probably, it probably sounds like a negative, but it's not. She went down the academic route from university. And I think that I was able to see that and see what happened there. And I was that certainly made me think at the time when I was potentially considering that religious academic route that actually that's not something I do want to do. So that had a significant influence on me to make sure that I knew that actually that's not what I wanted to do with my life. In terms of other influences, I'd say that I had some CEOs fairly early on, and a common theme at the time was, that there almost seemed to be regret that they didn't go it alone. Either felt they didn't feel like they had had the opportunity, or they didn't really have the drive to go and do that. And I think that also played a significant part in me then saying, well, actually, I've got the opportunity. I've got role models that show that you can actually do it, and I don't want to be sitting there in 20 years' time where I am sitting now and going, oh, geez, I wish I'd done that.
So let's unpick Ben Parker a little, if I may. What drives you?
I think that I have very much a passion for winning. I think that comes from my sporting days. And one of the things that actually I've always, when it came to sport, for instance, and if we just draw a parallel to that, or draw back to that, should I say, is I never wanted to win in an individual sport. I always wanted to be part of a team.
Right.
And I think that because I always thought, well, what's the point of going and winning a tournament and celebrating on my own and saying I'm the best? It's all about the joy of celebrating with others and making that achievement. I enjoyed being part of a season where you had a table and a league table, and you won things together. And I think that that's carried through in business as well. So I enjoy, and that's probably one of the reasons why I've been able to retain the certain people around me, because I very much like to try and create that team atmosphere, and I really enjoy winning it. Succeeding in business, but succeeding together. I'm not one who sort of tends to hog the limelight or even crave the limelight. Certainly from an accolade perspective, I'd much rather that I carried people through with me, and they came with me, on the journey, and we were able to, whatever that next event might be, or even the raise that we did recently, to be able to say, actually, we did this together. And that's something that really does get me going and get me out of bed every day.
I was going to ask the question, you've alluded to it, I think, somewhere in your answer there, really, as to what success perhaps therefore means to you. But yeah, or not to make any assumptions, but I'll just ask the question outright. What does success mean to you?
Actually, my measurement of success has probably changed over time. I think that when we first started out, the first time somebody says that they want to buy your product is a massive success, because you're like, really? You want to? Because you have all the self-doubt. And then, that's a great moment. I think that the next time that somebody then says they want to invest in your business is a huge thing as well. So I think for me, success is just a series of milestones. Obviously, how you judge success and your own perception of it is going to change throughout time. I'm sure that some of the great entrepreneurs out there, Jeff Bezos, I'm sure it was about selling that first book on Amazon, and then that perspective changed. So I think that for me, it's just about setting that next milestone and actually achieving it is enough for me. I'm a simple man.
So what about away from the office, away from work? How do you unwind and relax?
That also has changed. I've got a young family. I'm a late starter in life in relation to that, so that keeps me busy. I don't know whether that's actually unwinding, but yeah, that's it's a nice distraction, because I think that until I had that, it was just work all the time. It was just all I thought about. Now you have something else that takes your mind off it. I'm still heavily involved with sport. I used to coach until only recently. Used to coach rugby every weekend, hockey and cricket as well. So they're passions. I would like to say I'm a reader, but I'm not really. I'm very much a theatre goer, and the ballet occasionally is a bit of a guilty pleasure.
So if you reflect back, what advice would you give 21-year-old Ben Parker?
What advice would I give? I'd look back and say, first of all, you made the right decision. And I think at that point, follow your instincts, because that would have been about the time when I discovered that religion wasn't for me. And I think that continue to follow your instincts, because they'll lead you well. And I appreciate that's not necessarily reflecting and telling myself something I didn't know back then. What I would tell them as well is that no matter how tough it seems to get, you do get through it. If you still put that goal in front of you and you have that goal, you'll get there. There'll be some tough rides, but you don't give up.
And I guess, we touched on this, but perhaps therefore, if you look at the wider entrepreneurial community, what message might you impart to any aspiring entrepreneur with a dream?
Well, funnily enough, I think that one of the things that wasn't accessible as much when I started out was the people that are around. There's certainly an investment community that's around that want to invest in entrepreneurs. And, there's so many people out there who are willing to sort of help you on that journey. Some of them do have a bad reputation, but, if you've got an idea and you want to pursue it, there's so many ways now to access that. So just get on and do it. Yeah,
I think to your point, you'll always have bad apples, but most prospective investors are, you're all on the same side. Really, at the end of the day, the right ones are on the same side. They want to succeed. They want you to succeed as much as you do. Arguably, not only for the vested interest. I think there's much more of a culture of entrepreneurial ship now than there was when I started out. Yeah. I think that there's, I'm not going to say to everybody you get on TikTok and you're going to be a millionaire overnight, but it's. I think that there are so many avenues now that just weren't even there when I started out. So we touched on what the future looks like for you. More time traveling, perhaps hopefully a bit of thinking time. Is there anything else that you've got lined up? No, well, you never know. If I sell out, I might go and lie on a beach for a while. I suspect you'd want to find something. That sounds like a wonderful idea. I think when you're in the thick of it, that maybe after a week, a day, a week, a month, a year, whatever, at some point you'll kind of go, there's something more. I need to go and scratch that itch again. No, I think so. I think that I've never done anything in the B2C world in terms of technology, so I think that has always intrigued me. And I'm also an avid skier and mountain sports fan, so I think that there's a few long treks that I've got planned as well outside of work. Fantastic. Ben, thank you. Before we wrap up, and we're just about to wrap, I just want to make sure that we can point listeners, where can they go to find out more about eflow or yourself, or where should we be pointing people? Yeah, I think our website's a good place to start at eflowglobal.com. A lot of good content, video content, podcasts, etc. RegTech is a pretty dry subject, so you may want to watch some of the video content. Fantastic. So it's eflowglobal.com is where we should be sending people. Yep. Fantastic. Well, look, I really appreciate you taking the time out. We need to wrap this up. I know you've got plenty more to pack into the day before the weekend hits us, and then the family takes over, and it becomes a different type of job that you're going to be doing. But wonderful success. Many congratulations on the journey on which you found yourself with eflow Global. It's it's always great to speak with founders and entrepreneurs, because I recognise there's a heck of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into making these things happen. Some heartaches along the way, some wins, some highs, some lows. It's a roller coaster of a journey, and all cliches apply. So it's great to have you on and for you to take the time out and share some of that experience and journey with us and our listeners on Extrology. So my thanks and my very best wishes for your continued success. I look forward to continuing to see you flourish. Thank you for having me, and hopefully we can catch up in the future. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.